Hello, computer animation students. This video is going to be explaining how to do the robot arm animation. So once again, that's the one you'll see in Google Classroom. So if you're struggling to do this at all, please just watch this video. It should guide you through fairly well as to how to do that. So let me just share my screen with you, and we'll go to Blender and we'll see how this is going to be done. So in Blender, what we want to do is obviously we're going to want to start by saving our files. So File, Save As. We're going to go into our C drive, into hopefully the folder you made, which is Computer Animation. We're going to call this, for lack of a better name, we'll call it Robot Arm. So I'll save that. And now when I come back in, what I want to do as always is I want to go into orthographic view. So press 5 on the numpad. And then I'm going to go into front view. So I'm going to go and press 1 on the number pad. I'm also going to delete out my cube so that I are starting with a blank sort of screen. I'm going to shift scrolling down a little bit just so I can kind of work with the x-axis as sort of my ground, if you want to call it that. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create essentially what looks like a robot arm. And so what I'm doing here is I'm going to firstly add a UV sphere, and I'm just going to cut this in half. So I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to A to deselect all, and I'm going to turn off my limit visibility, and I'm going to box select the bottom half of this, and I'm going to delete out those vertices. So what I end up with is I end up with sort of like a half of a UV sphere. So I'm going to be back in object mode now. I can click smooth to just smooth that out a bit. I'm going to position that down so it just sort of sits right on the x-axis. And now I'm going to just move up a little bit, and I'm going to click add mesh, and I'll do a cylinder now. Now the cylinder is too wide, so I'm going to scale the whole thing S.5 to make it half as big. Now, clearly what I have is a smaller cylinder, but I want it to be much longer because I want this to essentially be one of my robot arms. So I'm going to use the scale tool, that's this tool here, to scale it and make it much longer, but while still keeping it fairly narrow. So what I'm going to do is in this case here, I'm going to use my translate manipulator and just move it down so it's a little bit bigger. And I might actually even scale it a little bit longer still. And so I get it to about this point, I just position it properly, and now I'm going to click up here and I'm going to add another UV sphere. So add mesh UV sphere, and I'll smooth this out as well. And while I'm at it, I'll smooth out my cylinder. And I'm just going to position this so it tucks in nicely here. So about right there. And so I just want to make sure this sort of lines up nicely. So I'll just look at it from each perspective, from side view and from front view, make sure it looks pretty good. Now at this point here, what I can do is I can just duplicate my cylinders and my spheres to try and make some more shapes. So I'm going to Shift D in object mode, drag this over, and then to angle this, to rotate this, I'm going to R and then Z 90. So basically I can just R, 90, and then I can just go and pull this up, and I can drag this over a little bit and position this where I want it to be. So I'll just put it down a little bit, and that looks good. So at this point here, what I can do now is I can scale this in a little bit. I'm going to make it a little bit shorter. And I'm going to position it about here. And then I'm going to Shift D. And what I can do is if I press Shift D and then press the Enter key immediately, I get the translate manipulator down here again. And I can drag this perfectly straight across and then position the next ball here. And then likewise here, Shift D in object mode, press the Enter key, and then drag over the translate manipulator to get this here. And I'm going to shorten this as well. So I'm going to scale this down a little bit, make this a little bit smaller. And then I'll position it in here. And I'm going to then get my UV sphere again. I'm going to Shift D and then press the Enter key and use the translate manipulator to position it here. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to make sort of like a claw sort of shape here now. And I don't have, obviously that won't work with a cylinder. So I'm going to actually make the claw shape using a cube. So I'm going to go over about here, click on Add Mesh Cube, and then I'm going to go into edit mode. So I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to A to deselect all, and I'm going to B to box select, and I'm going to G and pull down, and I'm just going to pull down. I don't want to go too far. I just want to go halfway. So I kind of make it into a triangle rather than a cube. Now at this point, I'm going to A to deselect all, B to box select, and I'm going to pull down this part a little bit. And the same thing here, A to deselect, B to box select, and I'm going to G and pull up this part here a bit. So once again, G to move the points. But now I have something that looks a little bit like this. So if I go back into object mode, and on the side angle here, so using the y-axis scale, I will just scale this down, make it a bit thinner. So now what I have is something that looks kind of like a claw, and I will just G and position this over here, and this will be one of my claws. And I'm just going to rotate this a little bit so it sits about there. And then I'm going to Shift D, and I'm going to rotate this right around and then have this over here. And I will just position this up here and position this one here. And I will just rotate them so they're a little bit further apart. And G and pull this up a little bit so they're a little bit farther apart. So now I have something that looks kind of like a claw. So from side view, we see something that looks like this. Now, what we're actually looking at doing here with this assignment is we're actually looking to make a complex mesh, in this case, this robot arm, and then add bones, what they call armature bones in Blender, that will enable us to control with more detail and specifically a particular mesh object. Now think about if we were wanting to control a person, if we were to design a human being or something that looks like a human being, we would have to be able to control the arms and the legs separately from each other, as well as even fingers and so forth. So we want to be able to do that. Now this is sort of the starting point of understanding this. This is a more simplistic shape than a human would be, but still the same concepts apply. But one of the things we must do in this case is we must firstly join all of these individual meshes I have together. So what I'm going to do is in object mode, I'm going to shift right click on all of my shapes so that they're all selected, and then I'm going to control J to join them. So now if I were to move this, you can see that this is moving as one object. Now at this point, what I need to do now is add my bones. So how I add my bones is I'm going to start my bone down here, and it's actually very important where we start our bones, because where we start our bones is going to be basically the main or the most dominant bone. So if we start it here, this means that this bone is going to control all the subsequent bones after it. And so you'll see this in a second here, but the way we add a bone is we click on Add, Armature, Single Bone in object mode. Now, if we want to see this well, what I need to do is I need to do a couple of things. So over here on my tools, notice that there's a tool that looks like kind of like a man there. If I click on that, that's our object data. I want to go down here and I want to click on X-ray here. So I want to turn on my X-ray, and that will enable me to see my bone even though it's in the mesh. And I also, and I'm just going to show you what this looks like, the octahedral. So I'm going to click on edit mode, and I'm going to just pull this bone up so you can see it. So this is an octahedral shape, and there's nothing wrong with it. And just so you know, this bone will never render. So you won't see this bone when you do your actual animation render, even if it's sticking outside of the mesh. But nonetheless, I still find it a little bit cumbersome to work with. So I choose to, rather than have octahedral, I choose a stick. I just find it a little cleaner, easier to work with. Now what I want to do is I want to just go and look from side view and make sure that in fact I have this right smack in the middle, which I do. So then I'm gonna pull this over to the side a bit now that I have it on X-ray and stick. And while I'm in edit mode, I am going to then drag this up and to the spot where I want it. Then I can press the E to extrude, press the Enter key, and I'm going to use my translate manipulator to drag over. And then I'm going to click, and I'm going to click again, press E, and then press the Enter key, and drag with my left button of my mouse over here. So now at this point, I'm probably going to have to E and just sort of manually grab down and bring my bone over. So then right click on my point again, E to extrude, and then drag down. Now I'd like to bring these bones down fairly close to the end of the mesh so that the computer knows that this bone is controlling this hook here. Now at this point here, I just want to double check to make sure my bone is in fact lined up and is in the middle sort of my mesh, which it looks like it is. So I'm just going to go back into front view. Now this is important. This is how we make this bone impact or move the mesh. And what we must do is what we call parenting. So basically, in order to parent something, what we must firstly have is we must have one complete mesh. So if you haven't yet joined your mesh together, you must join your mesh together. Then we're going to, after we've selected the mesh, we're going to shift right click on my armature. So once again, it's the mesh first, then the armature second. So your mesh should look kind of sort of pinkish color now. Your armature should have a yellowish color. And then in object mode, which we must be in, we can hold down the control key, press P, and we're going to choose to parent with automatic weights. What this does is it parents the bones to the mesh so that now it should work and interact with one another. Now, it doesn't look like anything's happened here, but what we will see is while we have our armature selected, if we go to object mode, we see a second or a third mode, which we've never seen before, which is pose mode. And this relates only to when we're working with armatures. And so if I go into pose mode, and I right click on here and I test this, if this worked properly, then when I rotate this bone, notice that it rotates everything else. Likewise, this will rotate everything but, you know, from the bones down. And then if I test all this, we can see what this is looking like. So here I can see that this is working well. Here I can see this is working well. So it's looking good. Now, the next part of this I would like to do is I would like to go back into object mode now that it's kind of working the way I want. And I'm just going to add quickly a UV sphere and a cylinder. So I'm going to add a UV sphere, and I'm going to scale this down a bit, maybe make it about 0.7 of its size right now, and maybe even a little smaller, scale 0.8 more, so it's kind of fairly small, like about like this. And I'm just position it down as if this were the x-axis where its floor. And then I'm going to click here, and I'm going to add a cylinder now. So I'm going to add mesh cylinder, and I'm going to position this down here. And what the idea is that I'm going to pick up this ball, and I'm going to put it in essentially what looks like a trash can. So now in object mode I am in right now with cylinder. I'm going to go into edit mode now, and I'm going to just quickly, in face selection, choose face selection, I'm going to A to deselect all, and I'm going to select just this top face, and I'm going to delete out that top face. So what I have essentially is an empty trash can now, or it looks like sort of an empty trash can. So if I go back into object mode, it should look something like this. Now, at this point here, in order for me to see pose mode, I don't see pose mode. Why? Because I don't have my armature selected. So I need to make sure my armature is selected. That armature, right click on the armature in object mode, then I will be able to get into pose mode. Now, what we want to do is we want to animate this bones, these armatures, working to pick up this ball and put it into the bucket. So the very first thing we want is in frame 1, what I want to show you is that if you want to move across this timeline, you can hold down the scroll wheel, that middle scroll wheel, and drag across to move this along. And if you don't see all this, you can do that. But then over at the far right of this timeline here, we should see a lock-rot scale. So remember before when we were doing the animation with the wine glass, we had to lock-rot scale all the time. Now when we have this set, when I press the letter I, it will just insert keyframes knowing that it's a lock-rot scale. Now at frame 1, what I want to do is I want to select all the bones. So the easiest way to do that is to press A a couple times so that all the bones are selected. Then I'm going to press the letter I, which is now locked in all of those bones in that position. Now, what I also want to do is I want to turn on this tool, which is the record button. It's this little red dot here, and if I press on it, it looks kind of more grayed out. And now if I turn my keyframes up to, let's say, 25 frames, which is approximately a second, what I could do now is I could have I could start to move my individual bones, and what the record button will do is it will record each individual movement of the individual bones. So if I drag down to about here, basically, and that's what I kind of like, I can then go to, let's say, frame 50, and then I could have my claws sort of grab around the ball, and then I could, in frame, let's say 75, I could have my arm start to lift up and pull up. Then I could go to, let's say, frame 100, and I could position this, rotate this down now, rotate this up a little more, and sort of pull down so that I'm basically having this claw sort of right over my basket. So about, my mouse is messing around a little bit, but right about there. And then I could lastly at about 125, I could have my one claw open up so that the ball would fall out. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So basically if I were to run this, I have it sort of come, it closes, comes around, and starts to pick up. So it's looking pretty good. I mean, it could be better. We could mess around with this a little bit, but you get the idea of how you could start this. So I'm going to go back to frame 1 now, and now I need to focus on my ball, my ball I'm going to put in. So I'm going to I-lock-rot scale this at frame 1. I'm going to go to, let's say, frame 50, which is where I sort of wanted to have the ball, I think, well, I thought it was frame 50. Let's just take a look. So frame 25, I will iLock rot scale this, and I'm just going to see what's happening here where this starts to change. Oh, I thought I moved that earlier. So I guess I'm going to have to pull this up a little bit. So I'm going to have to maybe go, I might have wanted to go and redo those frames a little bit. For sake of time, I won't bother right now. But basically what I can do is I can go to where it looks like it's starting to grab hold of this, which is about there. And I could just sort of position my ball and start to have it to come up a little bit. And I could iLock rot scale, go to 50. So clearly my my claws, I probably wanted to move that a little bit more succinctly than I did there, but we can still kind of make it work here. So I'm going to go to frame 75, then I'm going to G and pull up and iLock rot scale. Then I'll go to frame 100 and I will G and pull down here. And actually I'm going to escape out of here and I'm just going to go to about frame 85 instead. And maybe move this a little bit more succinctly. So one of the issues I have is I should have locked in that top frame here as well so it didn't move, so that it wasn't opening beforehand. But we can still sort of set this as we see here and then see what it looks like. So at this point I can have this come down here to here, iLock rot scale, and then we can have at frame 125, we could have the ball go into the actual thing and iLock rot scale. So let's see what this looks like. So basically what I have is I'm grabbing it, I'm picking it up, and then I'm dropping it into the thing here. And so once again, the point of this exercise is to learn how to take a mesh, add some bones to it so that we can specifically manipulate individual parts. And so as long as you have this done, and I can see the animation on here, you can just submit your Blender file to me in Google Classroom. So hopefully that makes sense. Thanks for watching. And yeah, if you have any questions, once again, don't hesitate to ask.